A couple days ago, the Treasury Department released their latest update on ERA 1 and 2 payments, that is the Emergency Rental Assistance Program. We're going to look at some of the updates made by the Biden administration, some of the changes made in the policies of how ERA 2 payments must be doled out, or the provisions tied to the further allocation of ERA 2 funds. And we're going to look at the overall progress that has been made for each of these two programs. ERA 1 and 2 are the rental assistance programs that have been doled out by Congress from two different emergency packages in response to COVID-19. Basically, ERA 1 and 2 is overseen by the Treasury Department allocating certain amounts of money to each state. There are more than 200,000 residents in each respective area that's receiving state and local ERA funding. What I want to talk about is the difference between ERA 1 and 2 funding that has gone into effect under the Biden administration, because they were in power when the ERA 2 money was allocated from one of the bills that passed the second iteration of funding altogether. This was also something that was released in October. It's about reallocation of any money that's left over from the ERA 1 or 2 programs, and I doubt this is even going to be the case. I would be surprised if there is any remaining money from any of these programs after they are all exhausted. I would say that based on the progress that has been made and payout for either of these programs, there's still a ways to go. But there was a plan put forward to determine how each state can reuse or reallocate their ERA money if there is any left over after all applicants have received the money that they have requested. Obligations of excess funds. ERA 1 statute requires Treasury to identify excess funds for reallocation from amounts grantees have not obligated from their initial ERA 1 allocations. Specifically, the statute provides that beginning on September 30th, 2021, Treasury must recapture excess funds as determined by the Secretary, not obligated by the grantee for eligible ERA purposes. So, basically, this is just how you can reuse the money, and there is a deadline to the time in which you must reallocate those funds. It's a different time period for each of the two programs, but I want to look into ERA 2 policies that do apply to that particular program that is a little different than the policies that are tied to ERA 1. Under the Biden administration, there was a new set of rules for the emergency rental assistance money. I do think that in some instances, it is better to receive ERA 2 money than it is ERA 1 money. Even though there's less money set aside in ERA 2, there are some stipulations that make it so landlords cannot turn away ERA 2 money the same way that they can ERA 1 money. ERA 2, of course, was doled out by the American Rescue Plan. It includes $21.6 billion. $2.5 billion of that money is targeted for high-need tenants. And there are 9 enhanced policies to directly aid renters, prevent evictions, and help Americans transition to secure housing. Number 1, for the first time, programs are to offer assistance directly to renters if landlords choose not to participate. Huge difference. Today, the Treasury guidance makes clear that emergency rental assistance provided by the American Rescue Plan, or ERA 2, must be offered directly to renters when landlords do not accept payments. This will speed up payments to Americans who are most in need. Many landlords are working with tenants in good faith to secure aid and pay off rental debts. However, it is unacceptable to allow Americans to suffer eviction or homelessness simply because some landlords are turning down federal aid on their behalf. Number 2, cuts in half the wait for assistance offered to renters when landlords do not participate. In addition to requiring direct aid to tenants if a landlord refuses to participate, Treasury is cutting in half the time to determine whether a landlord elects to participate. Currently, where assistance is first offered to landlords, programs must wait 14 days when reaching out by mail or 10 days when reaching out by phone, text, or email before offering relief to the tenant directly. Those wait times will now be cut in half to 7 days and 5 days, respectively. Number 3 allows for the first time or offers of assistance directly to renters first, while rental assistance programs under the initial Emergency Rental Assistance Plan, or ERA1, required an offer of assistance to landlords before reaching out to renters. Today, the Biden-Harris administration has made clear that new funds from the ERA2 program can be used to provide assistance to renters first and immediately. Number 4 encourages financial assistance to support renters finding new housing. While the Biden-Harris administration will continue to do everything in its power to spur the use of emergency rental assistance to keep people in their homes, the new guidance recognizes that there may be increased need over the coming months for hard-pressed renters to find new housing. For emergency rental assistance to meet its housing security goals, the funds may need to be increasingly available to cover such costs as moving expenses, security deposits, future rents, utilities, and the cost of transitional stay in a hotel or motel when a family has been displaced. The Treasury guidance reinforces that each of these expenses should be considered eligible and encouraged uses of emergency rental assistance. So again, there is now guidance from the Treasury Department to help states reallocate their funds if they are not used directly for rental assistance. But under these provisions that only apply to ERA2, I cannot imagine how there would be any funds left if a certain portion of this money is used for helping those who have been displaced from their homes and evicted despite the emergency rental assistance money. That if not going directly to tenants from the ERA1 program, which does not have to go directly to tenants, and in fact can be completely rejected by a landlord altogether, then all the money that is then available with ERA2's funding should be going to assisting those who are experiencing displacement because they have been evicted. And it only makes sense that if there is money left over from ERA1, it should be put into ERA2 to ensure that as much money is set aside as possible or allocated as possible to ensure that those who will be inevitably evicted from their homes due to their landlords not accepting ERA1 money, they will at least have assistance in finding a new home that will be available through ERA2 money. And number 5, protects renters from eviction while payments are being made on their behalf. Starting with today's guidance, programs must prohibit the eviction of renters for non-payment in months for which they receive emergency rental assistance. While most landlords are working to secure relief and help renters stay in place, Treasury strongly encourages grantees to require that landlords not evict tenants for non-payment of rent for 30 to 90 days longer than the period covered by the emergency rental assistance as a condition of receiving payments. Again, incentivizing landlords to take the money and to not evict their tenants, something that landlords have routinely opted out of altogether. In many respects, the reason why these provisions might be put into place is because far too often landlords are refusing to take the rental assistance in order to evict their non-paying tenants and then price gouge their rents so that they make up for any losses that have occurred from not collecting on the rent money from their non-paying tenants. And this is obviously becoming such a trend that it has enacted these new policies under this new administration to make it so landlords do not have the option to turn away this rent money. Number 6, prohibits grantees from establishing documentation requirements that would reduce participation. Today's guidance makes clear that Treasury strongly encourages grantees to avoid establishing documentation requirements that are likely to be barriers to participation for eligible households. Matching the rules for Homeowners Assistance Fund, as suggested by many housing experts and advocates, unnecessary documentation requires too often to pose significant barriers to participation in the Emergency Rental Assistance Program, preventing families that need assistance from being able to receive it. Well, that's good, and that's true. Number 7, reduces burdensome documentation by allowing programs to verify eligibility of low-income renters based on readily available information or proxies, instead of documentation requirements that could prevent some of the most vulnerable renters from completing applications and receiving assistance. Programs will now be able to verify the income eligibility of renters using any reasonable fact-specific proxy, such as the average income in the neighborhood in which renters live. Number 8, prohibits ERA 2 programs from denying assistance to eligible residents solely because they live in federally assisted housing. As Treasury guidance states, grantees are required to comply with Title VI of Civil Rights Act and should evaluate whether their policies and practices regarding assistance to households that occupy federally subsidized residential or mixed-use properties or receive federal rental assistance comply with Title VI. With respect to ERA 2, grantees must not refuse to provide assistance to households on the basis that they occupy such properties or receive such assistance due to the disproportionate effect such a refusal could have on populations intended to receive assistance under the ERA, and potential for such a practice to violate applicable law, including Title VI. The guidance further encourages grantees to partner with owners of federal subsidized housing to ensure their residents are reached. Just so you know, grantees is the state which then can delegate responsibilities to another entity of sorts. The county in which Columbus, Ohio is located has delegated responsibility to a local nonprofit organization who is responsible for further doling out rental assistance on behalf of the county level or municipal level government. One of the reasons why they did that was because of the infrastructure that these nonprofits kind of already had in place. And so it made more sense to just use what was available instead of taking the time to create some sort of new payment structure or organizational structure and utilize what was already available. This nonprofit was already known for assisting local residents in the area with rental assistance specifically. And so it was just easier to pass off that responsibility to a nonprofit already operating in this capacity. Number 9, requires programs to document their prioritization of assistance to the renters most in need. Programs are required to prioritize assistance to low-income households and those with members who have been unemployed for more than 90 days. To help ensure that assistance is reaching those who are most in need, it's especially those with incomes below 50% of the area median income, grantees will be required to report how they will achieve the required prioritization of assistance. So these are all new policies that went into effect specifically with ERA 2 money. As you can see, the ERA 1 program has made strides in paying out their allocated portions much better than ERA 2. I did make this graph from the data. This is the combined ERA 1 and 2 money that has been doled out each month from January to October. Now, in some instances, states have done a little better in allocating their money, but still, when we're looking at the percentage of total funds allocated from each program, ERA 1 and 2, there's still a ways to go in terms of the remaining funds that have yet to be allocated based on what has been reported and what is still left over. This is the total amount of money doled out to each state. We're going to look at the total payout per state every month starting in January to see the progress of each state in paying out their ERA funds to the applicants requesting rental assistance, right? So we are anticipating this lighter lavender color to get as close to filling these bar graphs as the months go by. And this will be an indication of how much funding is still remaining to be paid out in ERA 1 programming alone. And then we'll do ERA 2. So let's go. As you can see, this is the amount of money that is remaining in the ERA 1 program that has been paid out almost in full in some cases, but in other cases, and again, we're looking at states N through Z, so these are only half of the states that have received allocated funds that we're looking at, and the total payout of funds as well. I don't have the exact difference in front of me, but as you can see, just based on the amount of room that is left in the darker purple bar graph, that is how much more money needs to go out per state that is still available for applicants. So there still is money that is available in the ERA 1 program alone. And this is the amount of money that has been paid out for states A through M with ERA 1 funding. I'm not going to say that there hasn't been progress that's been made. That's not what I'm saying. But I am saying that there's still a ways to go. And this is only the ERA 1 program. We're going to now do the ERA 2 program. All right, we got states A through M and the allocated funding per state to indicate how much of the initial funds given to each state has been paid out or given to the applicants requesting these rental assistance funds. Wow, so there's a lot of money that is waiting to be paid out in ERA 2 funds. As you can see, states have barely made a dent in their total allocation with ERA 2 funding compared to the amount that they have paid out with ERA 1 funding. There are new provisions that state that you cannot outright deny rental assistance if you are a landlord. In that case, the money will go directly to the tenant and will either go toward paying down the debt that they owe their landlord and back rent, or it'll be used to assist those who have been evicted and help with that displacement issue that they will then be dealing with. Time is of the essence to try and get the money out as swiftly as possible to tenants who are not only right now behind on their rent still, but now could be at risk for eviction. It honestly does not make sense when you think about how there is still a lot of money that is available. There was a notice from the Treasury Department to each of these states or the grantees on what to do if there is excess funds that need to be reallocated, which to me does not make sense. I don't understand how there could be any leftover funds based on the total number of individuals who are still at risk for eviction. And seeing as though with the ERA 1 program money, landlords could effectively refuse to accept the payment. So how exactly are we going to rectify this issue, especially for tenants who are kicked out of their homes, put on a blacklist registry, no other landlord will rent to them, and yet they didn't even receive the assistance that they had applied for because they applied for the ERA 1 assistance instead of putting that money back into the hands of tenants through ERA 2 allocation. These states or these grantees are receiving directives from the Treasury Department on how to reallocate the funds that are sitting in ERA 1 because all of the applicants might have been paid out, and because so many landlords were able to reject the funding altogether. They didn't even make it into the hands of all tenants who were desperately in need of some rental assistance, and now they need help getting back on their feet because they could be experiencing eviction. Even though there has been some progress made with the allocation of ERA 1 and 2 funding, there is still a ways to go for ERA 2 monies. Now that we know how much more money is available and still waiting to be paid out through ERA 2, hopefully that will assist tenants who are at risk of eviction. This will keep tenants from experiencing displacement if landlords are now unable to deny rental assistance. But also, we have to think about the possibility that ERA 1 money that was outright rejected by landlords could still lead to eviction for tenants who are not eligible or receiving the ERA 2 money that will be available to those who are evicted and now experiencing displacement. It is up to the grantees to make sure that they are doing their part in reallocating any funds that are available to go to ERA 2 money and assist tenants who are still at risk of experiencing eviction before it gets to the point where they are taken to courts for non-payments.